Welcome to today's Explainer. We're taking on a truly massive, frankly awe-inspiring subject today, decoding the Indian Constitution. You really shouldn't think of this document as just some dusty old legal text. It is literally the grand living blueprint of the world's largest democracy. It's the entire architectural framework holding together a nation of over 1 billion people. Okay, let's dive into this.
Here's our roadmap for today. We'll start by looking at this ultimate rulebook as a whole. Then we'll break down the difference between articles and sections. After that, we're exploring the core triad, your fundamental rights, directing the state, and finally, your fundamental duties. The whole document is neatly categorized into parts and chapters, making it surprisingly logical to follow. Section 1. The Ultimate Rulebook. Let's look at the master blueprint of a nation and its foundational pillars. To really appreciate this document, you've got to look at its scale. 395. That is the number of articles in the original text, divided up into 22 parts. Even with all of today's amendments and 12 schedules, that original 395 makes it one of the absolute most comprehensive constitutions on Earth. It's not just a vague philosophy, it's a highly detailed instruction manual. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is that before we even get to Article 1, the Constitution introduces itself. Adopted on November 26, 1949, the preamble is basically the ideological stage setter. It doesn't lay out specific laws, but rather it resolves to constitute India into a sovereign, socialist, secular, democratic republic. And its ultimate mission? Justice, liberty, equality, and fraternity. It sets the whole philosophical foundation. Moving into Section 2, Articles versus Sections. Let's zoom in a bit and decode some of that legal language we hear in the news all the time. And this brilliantly illustrates a distinction that trips up a lot of people. In the Constitution itself, we use articles. These deal with broad legal principles, the real foundational pillars, right? Sections, on the other hand, well, those are the smaller, specific units of a law found in acts passed by Parliament, like the Indian Penal Code, for example. So an article gives you a broad right, while a section gives you the everyday nuts and bolts of how a daily law actually operates. All right, Section 3, your fundamental rights. Let's talk about what the citizen gets. This is Part 3 of the Constitution. These are the basic, fundamental human rights guaranteed to Indian citizens, and they act as a super crucial restriction on the power of the state. We've got 6 core protections listed here: the right to equality, the right to freedom, the right against exploitation, the right to freedom of religion, cultural and educational rights, and the right to constitutional remedies. These rights are what we call justiciable. Basically, if the government violates them, you can go straight to the courts to enforce them. They are literally the bedrock of political democracy in India. But wait a second. If you're a bit of a history buff, you might be looking at that list and thinking, what happened to the right to property? Because originally, there were 7 fundamental rights. So where exactly did it go? Well, you see, the Constitution is a living document, meaning it adapts over time. The right to property was originally housed right there in Part 3 as a fundamental right. But it transitioned. It was moved completely out of Part 3 and became a mere constitutional right under Article 300A. What that means in practice is that while you can't be deprived of property save by authority of law, it just doesn't hold that supreme, highly protected status of a fundamental right anymore. It's a perfect example of how the Constitution can be amended to reflect changing national priorities. Let's move to and see how this builds into Section 4, directing the state. These are the goals for the government found in Part 4. If Part 3 is what the citizen gets, Part 4 is what the government aims for. And it is a fascinating balancing act. On one side, your fundamental rights are justiciable, enforceable by courts, and aimed at political democracy. On the flip side, we have the Directive Principles of State Policy, or DSP. These are non-justiciable. Their goal is social and economic democracy, essentially promoting the welfare of the entire community. Inspired by Ireland, these principles act as a guide for the government when they're framing new policies. It's just a brilliant dichotomy, balancing individual freedom rights against collective welfare. Which brings us to Section 5, your fundamental duties. This is what the citizen owes, wrapped up in Part IVA, Article 51A. Now, what's incredible here is that these duties weren't even in the original 1950 Constitution. The necessity for them was actually felt during the internal emergency period between 1975 and 1977. Inspired by the USSR, the Swaran Singh Committee recommended adding them. So, in 1976, the 42nd Amendment added 10 fundamental duties, things like respecting the national flag and protecting the environment. Much later, in 2002, the 86th Amendment came along and added an 11th duty specifically regarding children's education. So the crucial point is this. Much like the directive principles, these fundamental duties are non-justiciable. The courts can't directly penalize you just for failing to, say, develop a scientific temper. But does that mean we can just ignore them? Not at all. The courts actually use these duties actively to interpret the constitutional validity of other laws. Plus, they act as a vital moral compass. They remind us that while we fiercely protect our fundamental rights, we also bear a profound responsibility to the nation and to each other. It leaves us with a lingering question to ponder. In a thriving democracy, can rights really exist without the foundation of shared civic duties? Think about that the next time you reflect on the blueprint of a nation.